Hi everyone, this is Allan McKay. Welcome to episode 135. I'm with Mike Seymour from FXGuide. Let's dive in.
Welcome to the Allan McKay podcast. Allan is an Emmy Award-winning visual effects artist and mentor to many leading industry experts. Listen in as Allan talks with other industry leaders in film, video games, and visual effects about their experience, lessons, and methodology. Allan will teach you pivotal advice to fast-track your career, better your skills, and reach your ultimate dream job. Check out the latest episodes on allanmckay.com.
All right, welcome to a brand new episode. I'm going to make this introduction really short and get right into this episode. I'm excited about this. This is going to be a chat with Mike Seymour from FXGuide. And this episode is focused around the virtual human project that Mike Seymour had brought together, bringing in a lot of different experts from different fields to create a really amazing pool of technology, which was demonstrated at the MeetMike event at SIGGRAPH. This episode was really cool. Lots of great insights. It was really fun to chat with Mike about his whole journey with this. We talked about a lot of other things too, and I'm hoping that down the line I can put together an additional episode about some of the other things we talked about. But I wanted to make this episode super specific and focused on the journey of creating virtual humans. So this was a lot of fun, and if you want to check out the show notes as well as links to a lot of the resources, go to allanmckay.com/135 for episode 135. I got some really cool announcements coming up soon. Later this month, I'm going to be opening up the doors for the mentorship for 2018. So this is going to be a lot of fun, and you don't want to miss out. Otherwise, you have to wait till 2019 for registration to open again. So that's going to be coming up pretty soon as well. If you're not on my VIP Inner Circle email list, then you'll be able to see a link in the show notes, or otherwise just go to allanmckay.com/inside, one word, inside, to get on the waiting list there as well. All right, so that is it for now. Let's dive in. Obviously, for you, one of the things I think has been so cool to see come to fruition was the MeetMike project. So within that realm, I was kind of curious if you can talk a little bit about how that came to be and a little bit about it in general.
Yeah, I mean, I guess from a career point of view, I think you've done some really interesting advice for people about it's not just knowing this tool, it's how you sell yourself kind of thing. And I think there's a third dimension to that triangle that is a little less discussed, which is a sort of a positioning your expertise component. And I find that artists sometimes don't think down the road a long way on the tool set that they're developing that will feed into their area of specialty, that will then, of course, feed into what tools they actually need and how they present themselves to the community. So while I totally applaud the stuff that you've done, Allan, and I think it's absolutely right, especially on showreels, especially on the stuff that you've been publishing on, just generally getting out there and promoting yourself. The thing for me, sorry?
Oh, no, I was just saying positioning's everything. I agree with what you're about to say, 100%.
Yeah, but the other thing is I think one needs a bit of a long-term plan. And I certainly moved away from Flame because I sort of just felt like that was not going to take me down a new path, and I want a path. There was nothing wrong with the path. I adore it, but it wasn't like going to be opening up and be somehow kind of narrowing down a bit. And I think that's been borne out by the fact that if I'd wanted to go further down a compositing path that was split out, I would have had to have gone into Nuke, heavily into some parts of Nuke, and gone down that path. And I was like, okay, well, that's an option. I could definitely do that because I love the guys at the Foundry. And in fact, I went to uni with one of the founders and I totally love that to death. But as much as I love Nuke and think it's brilliant, I was interested in doing new stuff. And my original research stuff was in 3D, and it's a long way away from. So I wanted to get back to stuff in 3D, and there are a lot of people much better at 3D. But I decided that one of the areas that was of great importance to what I thought would be the future of storytelling and general communication stuff, and was outside just what you might describe as films, was virtual humans, digital humans. So I'd always been interested in that area, which kind of overlaps with cognitive science and a lot of stuff, cognitive research and stuff. And so I decided to go down this path of looking at what I call actors, agents, and avatars. So that's the three kind of applications of virtual human tech. Plus, in a sense, you could argue that a bunch of problems in 3D are kind of solved. And you could, in a sense, argue that problems in compositing are solved. But you can't say that about virtual. And so I've often found that if you can find an area that has a lot of unknowns, it's a rich field to plow, and then you'll benefit from that when that crop grows a few years down the track. Plus, I really wanted to get on this podcast with you because you invited Chris Nichols on episode 28, which was exactly 3 years ago and 102 episodes ago. And it's taken me that long to get around to matching up with my friend Chris. And so Chris and I these days do a bit of work together off and on. And so Chris is somebody I admire and think is great. And Chris has been involved in doing this with the Wikihuman Project. So Chris started doing stuff about Wikihumans. I was like on to Chris and said, totally want to be involved. And then so with another bunch of people that are part of that Wiki project, I've really enjoyed building and pushing in this particular space, to the point that I've devoted a significant amount of my time now to just research.
No, that's great. That's so cool. I was going to touch on that just to see out of the Wikihuman project, like whether it was like Dan Rorty or Paul Debevec, who out of that team was involved in. And also just in general, I mean, it sounds like that you managed to cultivate like a big group of the greatest minds into, that brain trust of their expertise for this. I mean, who in general were all the culprits?
Well, let's just start with Paul Debevec for a second, because Paul is a great guy and a good friend, and I've known him. He took me out. I went him out on sushi, and I was thinking of doing my PhD. I had this great plan for the PhD. It was going quickly, cute, and he totally just stripped off me. Only a good friend do, and said, basically, what do you need a PhD for? It's like a complete waste of time to do something like this. It's easy. You should do something incredibly hard. Otherwise, kind of almost like, he didn't say this, but it was almost like, I don't want to know you if you're just not going to bother trying to do the hard. And then the second thing he said is like, you can report on a lot of stuff, which obviously I'm doing with FXGuide 79 with John Montgomery and Jeff Huser. You can report on a whole lot of stuff, but at some point you've got to get off the side benches and actually invent some new stuff. So I ripped up my plan for what my research was, adopted this new, and then thanks to Paul, I had an internship overseas, like residence for a little bit. I started doing research in this area, and over a period of time, as I say, with Chris and the other team at Wikihumans, built up Virtual Human, which we use me because I'm ethics approval is really easy on yourself. And also, if I had to take me somewhere to get me, like, for example, I did my head at USC, the light stage, but I did my eyes at Disney Zurich in Switzerland, a great over there. Well, if I have to go to Switzerland, I only have one airline ticket if it's me and eyes. If I were using you, I'd have to find you free in your schedule and fly you and me to Zurich, which is, so we did that. And then we were lucky enough to, because I got to know a lot of people from FXGuide over the years. And I like to think FXGuide is, because of the work that John, Jeff and I do, is a positive thing. Like, we don't tend to print negative things, and we tend to try and illuminate complicated technical problems. And that's gained us a lot of respect from the research community because, they're like, be frustrated that people only wanted sound bites in press statements. So we'd get in, dig, explain them. And so that meant that we had an audience that, a healthy audience, don't get me wrong, but we weren't going for like the mega audiences. I've done bits for Wired and I get like 1 million views, but it doesn't have the depth. And I'd kind of prefer to have, tens of thousands of readers where at least a significant proportion of them are like really seriously interested in the stories than the million and it's just like clickbait. And so that's served us really well. John and I and Jeff decided that early on. And so we write stories that we know people don't necessarily just find easy to read, but we also like to think that it's good to have somewhere that isn't punches and not speaking down to people. That meant this web of just knowing people all over. So when I came to do this research, I was very lucky to talk to friends, key places, and Kim, the CTO of Epic, key, and he got the Epic team involved, so that gave us real time. We got the team at Cubic Motion involved in Manchester. That gave us some AI technology for markerless facial capture. We got the 3Lateral team involved in Serbia with Vlad, which gave us one of the world's greatest face rigs. We got the Loom.ai team, which have just done the Samsung, or just announced the Samsung Avatar project, and they gave us the build a face avatar from AI really quickly technology for the people that I was going to be talking to. And so we pull all these things together, some researchers and work out at university. Dr. Mark Sager, he gave me advice, just a lot of people. And as you know, like, filmmaking is a collaborative sport, right? Mm-hmm. So at no point in life should anyone ever try and do anything by themselves. You just want to get with people that are much cleverer than you and hang out with people that are much better than you. You'll always end up on a much better project. And so that all came together first in Auckland, in LA at SIGGRAPH 2017, where we produced this real-time 90 frame a second virtual human, which was interviewing other virtual humans in VR.
That's so cool. And yeah, I love the fact that you did bring together, all these specialists who had their bit. I mean, as you mentioned, Switzerland specifically for the eyes. I mean, I think that everyone is focusing on their one piece, and you being a cultivator of bringing the band together essentially to do something amazing, I think been really cool. And I guess like two key things would be like, what were some of the biggest hurdles to overcome for the process? And I'm also curious like how the whole thing's received.
Well, let me say right away, Allan, that the big thing about what we did is I'm not trying to spin this into a company, and I'm not trying to make money from it in some, like I'm finish this research and product. And so as a consequence, we're kind of Switzerland. And so we got all these people to work with. It was a research project. And one of the tenets that Human Project, my research has, is to give away all the data. So the process of packaging up data from SIGGRAPH to give out to the community to use. And that was one of the key aspects of Together, because if I'd gone to Disney and said, hey, can you give us some stuff that we're going to sell? They would have been like, no, obviously not, because, a major corporation. But when you go to a university or you go to a major company and you're saying we're doing this research, and the researchers in their organization know you and trust you and say, yeah, when he says that, he means it, then they can, get their organizations. And of course, it's to everyone's benefit. And in my experience, all the people involved, including what you might call the lawyers in the companies, actually just want to move the ball down the field. And so if it helps everybody to do this research and no one's going to be ripping anybody off, then they're all in. So that's been really, really positive and great. And I just can't underline enough how collaborative and hardworking these people have been to pull stuff together. Actually, I forgot to mention Tencent in China as well as another major contributor. So all these companies come together and say, we're going to contribute and do stuff as long as we can all, benefit, and you can publish to the community. In exactly the way that Pixar turns up at SIGGRAPH and publishes, the same way that, the Foundry posts free things for people to have. Like, if you're doing that with the right intention and doing it to give out to the community, you tend to get a lot more back in turn. So I think that was the answer to your first question. I can't remember what your second question was, Allan.
No, I guess the two-parter was mainly, what were some of the big hurdles? And then I'll follow up with the second part. But I mean, for you, obviously doing a realistic face, one that people can relate to, is such a huge challenge. So I was just curious more as a 30,000 foot view, like what were some of the big challenges? I mean, let's say eyes alone. I mean, a lot of people, when they try to approach doing something like this, the dead eye effect is definitely one that people can relate to. So, I mean, for you, like, let's say the skin and getting realistic real-time skin pores and getting realistically lit and reactive skin, like, what were some of the big challenges that you guys had to overcome?
I mean, the biggest thing is just render time. So if you were to take let's say you're talking to Pixar, great guys at Pixar, and certainly Christoph Henry involved in the subsurface at Pixar, like, just contribute to the amazing stuff. But if you look at the problems that they're presented to get, it's inside the framework that, speaking in terms of notional cores, it's a 2.5 hour render, right? It's not obviously an elapsed 2.5 hour render, but like a 2.5 hours of frame is the sort of core metric that we would use for how long they frame. Right. And 2.5 hours is how long it takes to fly from Rome. We had initially about 30 milliseconds. Actually got down to 9 milliseconds to get our frame rendered, which is the time it takes for the plane to move 4 meters. So you couldn't even walk from economy up to business in the time we had to render a frame, as opposed to what you have in a feature film environment. So real-time rendering is the single biggest problem. Now, you might say, okay, but if you're concerned with realism, why just not render it out of real time? But the big thing about this research, the really pivotal area that my personal interest is in, is the interactivity of that face. So isn't it just enough that we rendered a good-looking face that I can produce a still that looks good? It's that there's a whole different thing that comes into play when you can actually talk to, interact with, and deal with that person, that face, that thing. That's a big difference. So if we think about the uncanny valley for a second, which I'm familiar with, the original uncanny valley theory says, obviously, Tom Hanks as Woody, we love. Tom Hanks as the conductor on Polar Express, we hate with a vengeance, but Tom Hanks himself is the most beloved actor of his generation. Anything looks like Tom Hanks, marvelous, right? But the theory also said, if you move, it accentuates the valleys and the peaks. So in other words, it becomes more realistic at the high end, but more unrealistic, annoying, if you like, freaky or uncanny in the trough. But that changes with interactivity. This is a really key point. It isn't that when you interact. So up until now, we've had these research efforts that have taken a bunch of stills, taken a bunch of clips, shown them to people and said, hey, what do you think? What do you think? What do you think? And everyone said, yes, there's uncanny valley, or can we make it more realistic? And of course, a lot of focus on the discussion in the popular press labels the uncanny valley as some kind of Turing test for I did not know it was fake. But my argument is you can have an interactive face that is incredibly good and is no longer uncanny. Now, you may not think that it's real. You could talk to my avatar and you say, you, Allan, would be like a perfect case. You'd say, oh, I can tell that's digital, but I actually find it agreeable, nice, not uncanny. It's really fun, and I'm sort of sympathetic to a way that the literature would suggest impossible. Now that's really significant because there's a whole lot of areas in life where if we could have synthetic humans that were useful and appealing, even if we didn't think they were 100% real, but they looked realistic enough that they weren't at the bottom of the uncanny valley, and we were interacting with them, then our lives would be significantly different. And so that's what really appeals to me. So we had to go in real time. We had to be interactive. We wanted to go like the Rolls-Royce of interactive, stereo, 90 frames a second, high res, full head tracking, the lot, to see whether this sort of theory that we had was right. And it was. In fact, compared to a cartoon avatar that's also there, the photorealistic face was more friendly, less uncanny, and in fact more trustworthy than the cartoon version. And so that's really different than the current sort of narrative about the uncanny valley, which is unless you can get it perfectly real, it's no use, and it's crap.
Mm-hmm. No, I love it. I think that's actually another brilliant thing you brought up is the fact that the interaction, because again, like it's very easy to look from the looking glass at something very judgmental because you're looking at Polar Express, something like that. You're looking at what's wrong with it. But when you're interacting, I think you kind of let your guard down and you're more focused on the experience itself rather than it being about like looking at something and trying to look for the imperfection. Like, what is it that's wrong that is making me feel weird about it or whatever. So, no, it's great. Cool.
We're kind of taking it even further and looking at like what is it neurologically that's happening and which part of the brain is these changes and whether my cognitive psychology combined with my neurochemistry is actually processing this stuff differently. We believe that it's involved with mirror neurons and a bunch of the brain processes information, allowing you to accept much more face and you come kind of happily in the moment. You have presence, but this is sort of super complicated at one end, but we need to get super complicated because it's not enough to just say, hey, that looks good and it doesn't. You need to be able to articulate why. And the why is really hard because you have these special pathways that process things differently. You have a pathway that just processes eyes, a pathway that just processes mouths. And so if we don't understand these things, the thing at the moment is you've got a visual effects supervisor. Like let's say you've got a really, really good visual effects supervisor, Ben Snow, somebody like that just really knows their money. They'll be able to articulate what's wrong in an image by looking at it. But getting that skill is so hard because we can't articulate it. And in fact, you have to sort of see past what your brain is seeing. So your brain which is why, for example, if you want to look at blood flow on faces, it's typically the case that we'll turn the face blue and then look at the blood flow in blue because your emotive system, when seeing blood flow in red, doesn't read blood flow. It reads emotional triggers, eye pupil dilation. It's very hard to read that in an eye because your brain is reacting to the fact that the pupil is dilating in a person, even though, of course, it's a virtual thing. So we have to kind of defeat our own neurological evolution to be able to understand what's being triggered and then come back around to being able to produce it in a reliable way so that we can produce, a good Allan that uses an avatar that would be friendly and people would like.
I think it's brilliant because you're right. Like, people will pixel fuck the hell out of a shot trying to figure out like what is realistic. And when you get onto the subject, it is such a diverse subject that in a way you're talking about more behavioral psychology there where, we're trained over time to figure out like, how do we perceive a stranger? Are they trustworthy? All these little kind of micro gestures that everyone's doing, we're reading and interpreting and trying to understand what's going on. And that experience that we have, we take for granted on the surface level, but all of these things are helping us get a better understanding of, do I like this person? Do I trust this person? All the interactions that you generally have with that, with any person.
So let me give you an example of this. And this has come out of my research. So there was a client who was looking at a head and they'd isolated the head. So the person was talking, but the head literally wasn't. Clearly, you'd think that as a VFX artist, that's a sensible thing to do, right? I'm going to isolate the head so we can just study the face and what's going on it. The client said that the upper teeth were too rigid and not animating enough. Now, Now, if you think about that for a second, that's absurd because the teeth are connected to the skull. In fact, it's the only place on a human face that you can actually see what the skull is actually doing, because the rest of the face is covered by muscles and fat and skin, and those muscles are ribbons and they're not even attached to the skull directly at the front of your face. They come around from the side. But your teeth directly attached to your top skull, which directly doesn't, move. Now, what the client was reacting to was that the skull was frozen, and they're articulating that in saying that the top teeth should move more, which is something that the human body physically can't do. Now, the person that was saying that wasn't stupid. It was just that when we're presented with a animating body where the head is frozen, which is something in everyday life we never see, they just couldn't articulate what was wrong. And so they were grasping at trying to come up with what was wrong through a brain that was saying, hey, this is incongruous, this is not right, and I haven't seen this before, so I can't give you much help as to why it's wrong, but this face is wrong. And we're turning to these directors or whoever and saying, hey, what's wrong with this? Can you approve the shot? And they're like unable to defeat their own neurological evolution to be able to articulate it. And we get upset with them if they can't do it. We say, God, what a ridiculous comment that they thought the teeth should move, right? Yeah. But in fact, it's really cruel to be in that position where you're asking somebody to articulate these. Now, tell them about a laptop, no problem, right? You don't have evolved brain patterns for dealing with laptop. Here's a phone, here's a 3D rendering of a phone. Do you like it or not? I mean, I can tell you a lot about that. And I can get all whatever about the specular highlights, or it looks plasticky and whatever, because I can analyze it free of the emotion of a phone. My brain hasn't developed to read the emotion of phone. But any director, any supervisor, that matter, or artist, is really hard up against it to try and articulate some of these things. So we need to give them the tools that allow them to understand and work out what's going on, because it's just really hard to ask them to do this and then just sort of say, well, if you can't do it, then you're obviously not very good at your job creatively. They should be good at saying what emotion they want in this scene. They should be good at saying this furthers the plot in these areas, but they shouldn't have to at articulating whether this subsurface scattering algorithm is accurately modeling a millisecond or 3-second delay on the hemoglobin redistribution happening after a pressure gesture move. And that's just like dumb to ask them.
Yeah, it's amazing. Like, what other findings obviously this has become a big part of your life that you've been living and breathing. And I mean, like, what are some of the other fascinating kind of or not obvious things that you've come across that you're really surprised about when you started to dig into it?
I guess one of the ones that I found really early on that was really interesting is, so Paul Debevec had a 3D face scan done. It was terrific. And they wanted it for a magazine. And I forgot which, it's like New Yorker magazine, right? Like some,
Yep.
This is like a couple of years ago. And
if you Google the New Yorker, you'll find it.
Okay, the thing about it is it was a bald Paul, right? And if you know Paul, you go, that looks really bad. And people that don't know Paul think it looks really, really good. And I was looking at this and we were trying to work out why it was that people that knew Paul didn't like it. People that didn't know Paul thought it was just totally great. And so some people just walk away and say, oh, it's just familiarity. You know that it's an accurate match or not. But that wasn't it. What had happened, we discovered, is that the New Yorker, or whatever magazine it was, didn't want to publish just what I'm going to call the hockey mask of Paul. They wanted a head of Paul so that it looked more realistic. Now, they hadn't scanned Paul's head. And so they're working with Activision at the time. So one of the Activision guys from the lab, whose skull was scanned because he was bald, they stuck Paul's face on this guy's head and made it look real. And it did. It looked totally real, really great, except for the silhouette of that skull isn't Paul's silhouette. And so us that knew him were looking at the face and saying, I can't tell you what's wrong with the face, but it's wrong. What we were actually reading is that there was a part of our brain that processes silhouettes. So I can see my wife in a crowd when I can't see her face and I don't know what she's wearing, but it just pings out right straight away. There's my wife, right? And so I have a Paul Debevec, I didn't know this, but I had a Paul Debevec silhouette in my head, and that wasn't his silhouette. And so it was an incongruent sort of bit of information that my brain was saying, is Paul, isn't Paul, is Paul, isn't Paul, man, there's something wrong. And of course, as an articulate guy, I tried to articulate that and, of course, focused on the ears or the mouth or the nose or the eyes or something like that, thinking that that would be the answer. And, of course, it wasn't that at all. It was the thing I wasn't looking at that was throwing me. So that's, I thought, really interesting. But if you hold that in your head for a second and say, okay, that's really good, then sort of riddle me this, Batman. Why is it that if I watch an old episode of the TV show, pick a show when you're like Happy Days, whatever, and it was shot for television of the day, which is, of course, a 4:3 aspect ratio. Now I'm watching it in a hotel or a bar or something. It comes on and they compress it out to 16:9. So there's Richie Cunningham and the Fonz, and their heads are stretched horizontally, yeah? They're clearly now 4:3 into 16:9. Simplest problem in the world. Except for, I don't say, oh my God, Uncanny Valley doesn't look like the fonts anymore, I like totally buy it. I mean, I know that it's stretched, but I don't like have an uncanny valley response. Yet the head is grossly wrong. So how can I, on one hand, be so upset by Paul Debevic's silhouette being not quite right, and on the other hand, be okay with Richie Cunningham or Fonz's head being, like an oval instead of a circle. And so there's just so much stuff going on there in terms, which of course, we have theories about, but it's like, whoa, it's a really new problem, which is why it's so much fun.
I guess that's the tricky thing too, is the fact that it's not just one thing. Because if it was, then, it'd be like, okay, clearly, to make photorealistic human beings that we can interact with and believe they're believable, we're just got to make the silhouette correct and, it's done. But you're right. I think it's just like this infinite checklist of things that one by one you got to kind of go through and hope that you can bring it all together for this magic combination. That's going to be so difficult. Like Valve Software, I remember they were incorporating a study on what you talked about silhouettes, because I think there was a video game called Team Fortress 2. I never played it, but I remember reading about it at the time, that they decided that rather than, they wanted everyone to easily identify a class of character in the game very easily, just within a split second. And they figured rather than textures or faces or anything like that, it would be the silhouettes would be easiest to identify. So that way, within a split second, you could tell what type of person the class was or whatever in the game. And I think it's kind of interesting to look at, like, what are the things that we evaluate first when we're interpreting something, whether it's threat or friend or what it is. And again, like, that's one that resonates when you talk about this.
Yeah, because you have these gross things that are really interesting, and then you have these micro things. I mean, I think that War of Planet of the Apes has some of the most spectacularly good facial animation, especially on Bad Ape. But if you look at some of the performances of Bad Ape, we are down to literally fine-tuning render outputs that are causing those emotional things. In other words, horror movie can roar at you and run at you and scream, and it's obviously scary, and there you go. But the nuanced performances they're getting out in, say, Bad Ape, talking to Caesar, is coming from the smallest pings at the bottom of the pooling of moisture around the eye that just wouldn't be there unless you're in a final render. And the nuanced of the performance that it's providing. Now, I'm take nothing away from the actors that are providing the motion capture of this. But let's face it, like, motion capture is a fairly coarse kind of thing, right? We're not capturing glints on eyes in motion capture, and yet that's what's giving me some of the emotional read on these really new apes that I think is just some of the most impressive acting we've ever seen out of virtual character. So it's good to understand these things. It's good to be able to control them. But, we have this really weird thing that I'm looking right now at a little thumbnail of you on Skype. That's, we're not got video going here. So there's
I'm looking at a virtual one of you.
Yeah. But my point is, it's small. It's not very high res. It's whatever. It totally looks realistic. So we don't need massive amounts of render. We don't need to be like 4K to get realism. But that doesn't look like a virtual you. It looks like a real you, even though it's like a postage stamp. And so how is that possible, right? Like, how is it possible this low-res, crappy sort of thumbnail icon I read as real, and the same small thumbnail icon of me you detect as being virtual? It's like
right.
Like, what's going on in your brain? Like, it is so, and it's so important to get right, because films like War of Planet of the Apes are just masterpieces. They masterpiece this stuff right.
Yeah, I still remember going to see both War and what was the one before that, Rise. Yeah, I mean, again, it's so rare. I think that we're all desensitized to CG, but like, it's so rare that I actually go see a movie where I'm trying not to think about the CG. And with that movie, I was just like, holy shit, it's one of those moments that I was happy to detach myself and just say, like, wow, like, I can't believe
in the second film, you've got Koba. When he goes at the guys that are got the guns, you've got Koba as a character who's acting as that. So the character acts in the plot stupid, and we as an audience understand that this digital character has this persona with a completely separate motivation, which he's then channeling through a fake performance to fool some human on a screen. Like, so we don't think he's stupid at that moment. We know he's really clever, just acting stupid. But it isn't a he, it's a render of an ape. And that Koba performance with the guns is just, I mean, I think like that right there is like one of the great moments. Come back in time and look at and say that was a performance moment for virtual character. And then, as I say, Bad Ape in the newest one was another one of those. And there are other examples where you get, Groot or something in Guardians. So there's not isolated instances. And there are some really good virtual humans stuff being done. I think Joy was great in Blade Runner, for example. But, like these moments are incredibly hard to get. And of course, if you don't do them quite right, as in the mustache of Superman, he just rip you to shreds. It's like the film is like categorized as a major disaster. They got his top lip wrong. Think about that for a second, right? Like, that's just extraordinary.
You look at, like, that's also the tricky thing about CG in general. Like, whenever I see bad CG, I'm always thinking, like, there's the story behind it. Before you judge, there's always a story behind it. So you go on YouTube anytime right now and you type in bad CG, I guarantee the Scorpion King will come up. And I remember watching the making of for that when it came out. And it was they're pointing out, like, if you look at this background, it's black because we didn't have a budget to put a background in the shot. And they were in such a shoestring budget, like doing a full CG character, like that alone is ambitious, let alone on the budget they have. And again, you look at the mustache, like some people might put their finger on, like, why does his face look odd? And then you start reading into it, and it's just like this huge political battle between two studios and who's going to flip the bill for replacing someone's mustache because they contractually are not allowed to shave during the film. And like you're right, like there's things like that are obvious, and it's maybe because there is a story behind it, but the subtleties, like I remember watching Pirates of the Caribbean 2, and at the time, again, trying not to think about CG, but you're looking at Davy Jones and it's like, okay, like for me, I was convinced, like, okay, they kept his eyes and everything else is CG. Like, okay, I get it. Like that's really clever. And then later reading in Cinefx or wherever, FXGuide, it's like entirely CG. The eyes are CG. And for me, that was like, wow, I didn't get it. For me, it was like, there's no way that those eyes are CG because that's what gives it the life, and that's just it. Like all these pivotal moments from Gollum, even Jar Jar Binks essentially has a role to play. But yeah, just kind of seeing the evolution in these like pivotal moments, like even if it is such a small thing, but it solves a problem. I did a Q&A, I watched a Q&A at ILM and James Cameron came by when we were wrapping up Avatar, and I remember he was saying that I think it was Fox, they wouldn't let him put out any promo posters or anything like that of Avatar because they felt like the characters looked unrealistic, but it's the motion that sold them as being real. And without that, it just looked fake. So if you look at all the posters and promo material, there's nothing that actually shows the characters in there. It'll just be a close-up of an eyeball. It won't be any of them unless they are in motion. They felt like that was what interesting and real.
I mean, the cleverest thing he did there was make them blue. Right? Use our the particular part of our brain for humans to assess them for realism. I'll tell you a really funny thing. We and just to give a plug to the FMX conference in Germany. So I helped run the Virtual Humans Day at FMX Stuttgart Germany conference. We a couple of years ago invited an eye doctor, an eye surgeon, along to discuss eyes. In particular, he just did a magnificent job giving the most incredibly detailed discussion of eyes. But one of the most fun parts of the lecture, which was riveting, was at the end he diagnosed CG characters as if they were real. It's like, this character has probably got cataracts, this character will undoubtedly be going blind in the next 6 months, this character, like, it just was so funny, and so many things that people got wrong, that this was not a CG specialist, as an eye surgeon, but he'd like look at an eye and say, wow, this person must be really suffering from dry eye, the problems with the ... as he just, and it was so interesting to see that. But of course he'd been trained to look at eyes, not see the person, see the medical issues, that he could see these faults. And of course, when he articulated them, I was like, well, yeah, of course, I can see that now. That would have made Gollum's eyes so much more realistic. Now, admittedly, this was several years after, and don't get me wrong, I Gollum magnificent, but several years later, moved the ball down the field. But it is this trick that being able to determine what needs to be done in a shot, I've always thought is one of the greatest skills of a supervisor. Being able to give notes that are actually going to improve the shot and not just be random sort of throwing darts at the dartboard for what we should do to make this better is a pivotal aspect of what makes a great supervisor.
I love it. No, you're absolutely right. I mean, I've got 1,000 questions. I'll try to be sensitive about your time. So, I mean, I guess for this, so how was it received? I mean, obviously this went out and there's been a lot of buzz around it. Like, what's the reception been like for it?
Oh, it's been great. We've I mean, it's done exactly what it should done. It's, I think helped people understand the issues better and improve things. And I think we're going to see I know we're going to see some great stuff from Epic this year at both GDC and... Are you going to GDC?
I might skip it this year. I've got to fly out to Paris in a couple of days, and it's just been non-stop travel, so I'm trying to stay put as much as I can, but we'll see.
You can imagine that, given that I'm interested in interactivity, the GDC and GTC conference suddenly become super more significant than, say, an NAB. We're just throwing out lots of letters there. I apologize. The Game Developers Conference and the Real-Time Conference NVIDIA runs are more significant than the National Associated Broadcast. But so that's been great. And we've obviously continuing with the research. We're also looking extensively at some of the other issues. So stuff that is perhaps less relevant to your audience, but certainly stuff that we're really interested in is some of the applications of this technology beyond straight games or films, and a lot of the ethical issues around about where this is taking us and how we should be responding to those. And that's hugely interesting, as well as a lot of the cognitive psychology and a lot of issues around what it is to be a person and what it is to have a technology that is I'll give you a good example. Like if you were to, let's say I had some new shotgun type scheduling program, and I said to you, hey, can you test this out for me, Allan? You punch away at it. They're great. Could you mind filling out a survey about what you thought of this? And you said, sure. And up comes on your computer that you've been doing this on your top, the survey results. And at the last second, I say, wait a second, and I give you exactly the same survey on my laptop. You'd actually statistically much more likely to give it a harsher score on my laptop than on your laptop. Because even though there's nothing about this that's to do with faces or human, you've anthropomorphized your own computer and you don't want to be mean to it. And so even though the software wasn't from your computer and wasn't yours, you'll be nicer to it if you're scoring it on your computer than on my computer. Now that's a tiny window into how much power this stuff has. We move to having a virtual device. And of course, a lot of this stuff goes down this path of robots and androids and stuff, which is fairly sort of naive. The example I give is that it would be impractical to spend, I don't know, $500,000, $2 million buying an android that's like this sort of, Boston Robotics kind of two-legged thing that walks in and says, hi, Mike, I'm your plastic pal who's fun to be with, and then walks out and then opens the door, gets into the car and drives me somewhere, right? Like that android thing is an impractical and ridiculous thing to thinking about at a consumer level. I'd have to have more money than sense, and generally, why would I even want to do that when I just get in my car and the robot is the car? The car is just self-driving, right? And so this idea that our world is going to be filled with these androids is just silly. What we're filled with is a lot of the room becomes the robot. You're in the robot, if you want to call it that, and it facilitates you doing stuff. But you might have a face on the dashboard that you talk to about where to go, reassuringly drive for you, because you'll anthropomorphize the car that much more and trust it that much more and be much more willing to hand over your life and safety to the self-driving vehicle if it's a face. And if that's the same face that I was talking to in my office and the same face that I got on my iPhone, then I'm going to relate to that. And it should relate to me. It should become more familiar. Its language should change. It should speak more casually to me because I know it, in the same way that if you and I saw each other at SIGGRAPH and you said, hi, I'd like to say hello, my name's Allan, and introduce myself, I'd be kind of offended because we had this podcast and we've been talking and what do you mean you don't know? But at the moment, Siri does that. She doesn't act like I've spoken to her a lot. She just acts like I'm almost speaking to her for the first time. So we're interested in a lot of these issues, like how are we going to integrate this stuff into our life and how will it work? And then that gets to sort of interesting, slightly murkier ethic. For example, I'm a parent, and as a father, I used the same bedtime story over. And it'd be okay for me to have virtual Mike reading a bedtime story to my daughter. Would that be okay? Is it okay to do it if I don't have the time to do it? Or is it the fact that virtual Mike would have infinite patience, would never tire, would never stop, and would always be there, would never get upset, and would be, in a sense, the perfect parent, to quote Terminator 2. So, where does that going? So there's a lot of stuff out there interested in exploring beyond just the graphics. But to paraphrase literally something my father once said to me, son, I'm not making this anecdotally. He actually said this. He said, you can read the entire works of Sigmund Freud, but sooner or later you got to take a girl on it. And we feel like we've just got to build these things and make them and see how we react to them. Can't guess, because all this stuff is so bound up with what we have in our brain and how our brains have evolved that we cannot just guess at this stuff. We actually have to have these things, play with them.
No, I think that that's exactly what has been going on, is that a lot of people are more theorizing about what's realistic is the eyes, or I got to put skin pores in, and you kind of cultivating this group of people to start doing it and to actually start applying. Let's say, again, I'm going to go back to, as you mentioned, the eye experts in Switzerland as one team. Like if they're just focusing on that, they're not focusing on the interaction, the silhouettes of the heads, like all these different parts. And for you to kind of say, well, great, let's take it for a test drive and actually see how it works, like that is going on that date. And I think that that is where you're going to start to realize like a whole new level of problems that need to be accomplished. But it's something that needs to be done before you can kind of, like, I look at the iPhone 1, it's a terrible analogy, but I feel like the iPhone 1, was what it was, but it needs to exist before you can go and make all the amazing next level devices and VR, everything like that. There needs to be that first step, and that needs to exist, and then you can evolve and start going in leaps and bounds in new places. But for you, kind of creating that first step, it's been a really great opportunity to kind of bring everyone together into one place and see what's working, what isn't, and what are the results from all of this.
That's kind of you to say, but to wave the flag for my friends at Disney Zurich Research, they are very concerned about the whole process. One team was doing the eyes, but that's also the team that came up with the Medusa rig, which is ILM's, go-to facial scanning fax pipeline tool. So I know you were just using it as an example, but I'd hate for people to think that those guys were just doing eyes, because they are one of the great research teams. Nicest guys as well, and they've been super generous, and they really understand this. They get this. Like there are probably 4 teams in the world that I'd point to that totally get this stuff, and be one of them.
No, absolutely. And again, it sounds like been so many people and so much hard work and years of research leading up to every part of this. I guess my final question, because again, I could give you 1,000, I could go on all day, but I guess like for you, especially this being real time, this going into VR, I mean, what's been your experience getting to see yourself as a virtual human?
Oh, that's a good question. So Mark Sager pointed out that virtual me has better hair than I do. In fairness, he also said that the avatar I did for him, or we did for him, the hair for him. But I guess the thing that's really, well, there's a couple of things. Firstly, at a joking level, it's really funny because when I was scanning my head and then I was going back to SIGGRAPH to present the real-time stuff, almost a year had elapsed, like we'd been working on it for a year. The trouble was that when I was scanning, I was just super fit, and I'd actually put on a couple of kilos. And so I had this first world problem that I had to diet like crazy to get down to my scan weight, because otherwise people would say, oh, Mike doesn't look like you standing beside it because he's a bit thinner than you. And so we couldn't do that, right? So I couldn't change my hair. I had to look exactly the same, to wear the same clothes. But more importantly, I had to be exactly the same weight, which is such a ridiculous tail wagging the dog kind of phenomenon. It wasn't like I was grossly overweight or anything, right? It's just that we wanted me to be identical, and I was already a year older, which wasn't helping. So that was pretty... But I guess the thing for me is, we just use me because I don't expect this to be particularly important. But, Allan Kay, the Apple researcher and fellow, gave a lecture when I was really young that I went to. And he said, if you want to see the future, look in the labs today, because things don't just come out of nowhere. And so, for example, great work that Hal Lee is doing at USC. Now, Hal was on the team in PhD, helped develop the technology that went into both ILM's pipe, which then face monster stuff. It also went into the tech that Apple then bought, which then ended up in the iPhone 10 the iPhone. And so, in a sense, his work years ago was the lab, and now it's in my pocket. And so that's typically what happens. And so Hal is totally kicking it, his team at USC. As you know, Paul's now at Google, though he's Professor Emeritus at USC, and Hal now runs that previously primarily. But they're totally kicking it. But if you want to see what's going to be happening down the road, you kind of look at those labs. If you're in a lucky enough position to get in under an NDA or, behind the kind of natural academic kind of structures and see what these people are doing, it's insanely cool. So I think one of the great things is not so much what I learned from me, but of course, the more I've been doing this research work, the more I've been privy to talking to these researchers, obviously sensibly under the normal constraints of not wanting to spoil anything. We have kind of NDAs or whatever. And so seeing this work that's coming is just so thrilling. I mean, I cannot wait till this stuff moves out from ththese various labs around the world and become more freely available to people. But of course, it takes a long time to go from, we had at SIGGRAPH 9 8-core machines running the latest Titan X cards to get what we had happening. It was a ridiculous amount of compute power, and that was great, but that was a lab environment and gets shrunk down to next to nothing. But when you're building it at the research level, you don't care, right? If you need an extra PC, you just put an extra PC
3 years from now, I'll be on the iPhone.
Yeah, exactly. And so that's the the fun stuff for me. You get to play. The frustrating thing is, of course, is it doesn't normally work very easily because if, you sort of, so there are days that I sat there, pressed measure that I was ever going to get things to work. But I was really just one of the team, and the team did all the work, and the team did such a brilliant job. And I was just, it's kind of my face there. So working with those people and seeing what they're doing and seeing what's coming down the pipe, that's kind of the most fun bit.
That's great. That's really cool. And I guess from here, if people want to find out more about you and obviously about your virtual you as well, where would you recommend going to find out more?
I mean, I tend to publish stuff on FXGuide, and FXGuide tends to, because, it's not like FXGuide is, John, Jeff, and I don't run it as some kind of like major revenue thing. So what is on FXGuide is what interests us. Like over at FXPhD.com, we have things that we think are like relevant people right now for their jobs. FXGuide tends to be more things that are just, we find this really interesting. We hope other people. So I like to think everything from sort of my research and other stuff that people are doing, we get to highlight on FXGuide. And so naturally, if you look through the papers of the last year or two, you'll notice that loads of stuff has been there on faces, streaming 3D data, and fax pipelines. And our hope is that, we'll find that as interesting as we do. I can't imagine a universe. I mean, yourself, right? The wide shot is the one that you sort of put out trying to show someone cool work that you did. But most of the movie is a 3/4 or a close-up. Most of the story is told on the faces of the actor, the faces of the character. And so you take any film, like take Coco, the brilliant work that Pixar did, which again I had nothing to do with. But while the wide vista shots are super impressive, most of that story is played out on the face of a child. And that's what gives it its humanity, and that's what's most interesting. And so I can't imagine us publishing stuff about faces. Stuff is irrelevant, but we like to just draw attention to good research wherever it is. So yeah, FXGuide.
No, I mean, again, like for anyone who isn't aware, I mean, FXGuide is such a great resource. Again, I feel like you kind of touched base on it briefly earlier, but I think that there are articles people publish, which is more kind of just leading people down, like, have a look at this. But then FXGuide definitely has extremely relevant and extremely in-depth articles, and I feel like that's where you guys differ, and really it's very clear that you guys do what you're talking about. It isn't a journalist discussing a subject that they're more on the surface level about. So I mean, yeah, I definitely recommend for anyone who isn't familiar, then you must be hiding under a rock, but to check out FXGuide. So that's awesome. Again, I just want to thank you for taking the time to chat about all this stuff.
Okay, well, I'll let you go, but thanks a lot, Allan.
All right, so I want to thank Mike for taking the time to chat. This is really insightful. I had a lot of fun talking about all of the mind-blowing discoveries that Mike and all of the people involved in this project have managed to discover over time. And I think that the outcome so far looks amazing. I'm really excited to see where all this goes. And for me, I'm always looking at what's achievable now and what it really symbolizes for down the line as well. So hopefully we can do a couple of follow-ups on this down the line as things progress too. That being said, if you want to check out the show notes, go to allanmckay.com/135 for episode 135. You can get all the show notes, quotes, and a lot of the key takeaways from this episode. Now, next episode, hopefully I'll be releasing an interview with one of the VFX supervisors from Scanline. We're just getting final approval on the episode, and that's going to be a really cool one, so I'm excited for that one too. And like I said, my mentorship is going to be opening up registration later this month, so if you want to get on the waiting list for that, go to allanmckay.com/inside. All right, so that is it for now. I'll be back next episode. Until then, rock on.